Listen to this amazing story of miraculous healing. Enjoy listening. Christopher's Brooklyn apartment hummed with the familiar, comforting rhythm of procrastination. Sunlight filtered through the fire escape, and the leaves of a struggling potted fern illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, a silent accompaniment to the low thrum of his laptop. He was 30, a literary fiction writer, or more accurately, a brilliant, perpetually about-to-be literary fiction writer. His latest rejection email, a tersely worded dismissal of his short story, The Existential Angler, still glowed on his screen, a small, irritating pinprick in the otherwise perfectly curated bubble of his intellectual detachment. He exhaled a plume of bitter coffee steam, the ceramic mug warm against his palms. Another one for the digital dustbin. He leaned back in his worn leather armchair, surrounded by towering stacks of books, first editions, obscure academic journals, and literary theory texts that most people wouldn't even recognize, let alone read. This was his sanctuary, a fortress built of words and sardonic wit, and he was its undisputed, if somewhat stagnant, king. His phone buzzed, a jarring intrusion. Eleanor, his younger sister, 28, a corporate lawyer who navigated boardrooms with the same ruthless efficiency Christopher applied to deconstructing postmodernist texts. Their relationship was a carefully balanced act of affectionate exasperation on his part and exasperated affection on hers. He knew without looking that her call was probably to chastise him for missing their weekly family check-in, a ritual she insisted upon, despite his protestations that he was perfectly capable of feeding himself and remembering his own birthday. He let it ring, preferring the gentle hum of his own thoughts, the faint scent of old paper and brewing coffee, to the crisp, assertive tone of his sister's voice. His gaze drifted to a framed photograph on his bookshelf. Agnes, his grandmother, in mid-leap, her 82-year-old body impossibly graceful, a vibrant blur of color against a stark black background. A retired modern dance choreographer, Agnes was everything Christopher wasn't: spontaneous, uninhibited, and prone to pronouncements about the energy of the universe and the language of the body that Christopher, with his rigorous intellectual framework, found both charmingly quaint and utterly nonsensical. He loved her dearly, of course, but it was a love tinged with the affectionate exasperation reserved for beloved eccentrics. He sighed, the unwritten magnum opus weighing on him like an invisible cloak. He was brilliant, he knew that. His mind was a labyrinth of intricate ideas, his prose sharp and precise. But something always held him back, a subtle inertia, a kind of comfortable complacency that felt suspiciously like fear. He was perpetually on the verge, always about to start, always refining the opening sentence, polishing the first paragraph, never quite delving into the messy, vulnerable heart of the story. It was a comfortable stagnation, a gilded cage of his own making. Days bled into weeks, a predictable cycle of reading, thinking, and the quiet hum of promised creation. The Brooklyn spring thawed into a humid summer, and Christopher's routine remained largely unchanged. He'd occasionally catch himself rubbing his right breast, a small, hard lump beneath the nipple. He'd first noticed it a few weeks ago, a pea-sized anomaly, now perhaps the size of a marble. He dismissed it as a benign cyst, a common enough occurrence, or perhaps just a result of poor posture from hunching over his laptop for hours on end. The dull ache that sometimes accompanied it was, he rationalized, merely muscle strain. He was a writer, not a hypochondriac. His body, he'd always believed, was a mere vessel for his intellect, a secondary concern. Then came the family dinner, forced upon him by Eleanor, who'd arrived at his apartment armed with a casserole and a steely determination. She surveyed his book-lined chaos with a familiar, disapproving sniff. "Christopher, darling," she began, her voice a carefully modulated blend of affection and subtle judgment. "You need to eat something other than artisanal coffee beans and the ghost of your literary ambitions." He grunted, pushing a half-eaten piece of broccoli around his plate. "My literary ambitions are quite robust, thank you very much." "Oh, I'm sure they are," she said, her eyes narrowing as she noticed his absent-minded rub of his chest. "What's that?" He froze, his hand dropping. Nothing, just a pulled muscle. He tried to sound nonchalant, but a faint flush crept up his neck. There was something oddly embarrassing about a man having breast pain. Eleanor, however, was not easily deterred. Her legal mind was already dissecting his evasiveness. A pulled muscle? In your breast? Christopher, are you sure? Her voice was quiet, but there was an insistent edge to it that he knew well. Her radar for his self-neglect was unparalleled. He sighed, defeated. It's just a little lump, probably a cyst. I'll get it checked, eventually. Her gaze sharpened, and she put down her fork. Eventually isn't good enough. You're calling Dr. Miller's office first thing tomorrow. I'll make the appointment if you don't. There was no room for argument. Eleanor, pragmatic and efficient to a fault, had already won. A flicker of something he couldn't quite name. Not fear, not exactly, but a cold, unsettling premonition stirred within him. The mammogram was an indignity, a cold, clinical prodding that reduced him to a collection of tissues and shadows. The ultrasound was worse, the gel-covered wand gliding over the tender area. The technician's face a mask of professional neutrality that gave nothing away. He intellectualized it, of course, telling himself it was just a procedure, a necessary evil. But a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. When they scheduled the biopsy, that was when the first tremor of genuine fear snaked through him. He found himself researching male breast cysts with a frantic intensity, trying to find an explanation, a reassurance. Every article mentioned the word he was desperate to avoid: cancer. Eleanor insisted on accompanying him to the follow-up appointment. She sat beside him, a pillar of composure in her tailored suit, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Agnes, surprisingly, was also there, having arrived unannounced, her presence a fragrant cloud of lavender and old lace. She sat in the waiting room, observing the sterile environment with an almost detached curiosity, her bright, intelligent eyes missing nothing. The doctor, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes, entered, her expression grave. She didn't mince words. Mr. Hayes, the biopsy results are back. She paused, took a breath. It's invasive ductal carcinoma, stage 2IB, HER2 positive. The words hung in the air, a terrible dissonant chord. Christopher felt his ears roar, a sudden, deafening silence. Cancer, breast cancer, him. The irony was brutal, a punch to the gut. The doctor continued, explaining the aggressive nature of the HER2 positive subtype, the need for immediate, intensive treatment, chemotherapy, targeted therapy, perhaps surgery. She spoke of survival rates, of protocols, of a long, arduous road ahead. He heard the words, but they seemed to belong to someone else, a character in a particularly grim novel. Eleanor gasped, a sharp, choked sound, and her hand tightened on his arm, her composure visibly shattering. Tears welled in her eyes, then streamed down her face, glistening tracks on her usually impeccably controlled features. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound sorrow. Agnes, however, remained silent. She simply reached out, her gnarled, surprisingly strong hand taking his. Her grip was firm, grounding. Her eyes, usually so full of vibrant mischief, were still deep pools of an unsettling calm. There was no pity there, no shock, just a quiet, unwavering presence that somehow unnerved Christopher more than Eleanor's tears. He looked from his weeping sister to his serene grandmother, and a profound sense of injustice washed over him. His body, the vessel he had so casually dismissed, had betrayed him. His carefully constructed intellectual world, so impervious to the mundane realities of the physical, had just been violently shattered. He was not a mind, not a writer, not an intellectual. He was a patient, and he was terrified. Christopher's Brooklyn apartment hummed with the familiar, comforting rhythm of procrastination. Sunlight filtered through the fire escape, and the leaves of a struggling potted fern illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, a silent accompaniment to the low thrum of his laptop. He was 30, a literary fiction writer, or more accurately, a brilliant, perpetually about-to-be literary fiction writer. His latest rejection email, a tersely worded dismissal of his short story, the existential angler, still glowed on his screen, a small, irritating pinprick in the otherwise perfectly curated bubble of his intellectual detachment. He exhaled a plume of bitter coffee steam, the ceramic mug warm against his palms. Another one for the digital dustbin. He leaned back in his worn leather armchair, surrounded by towering stacks of books. First editions, obscure academic journals, and literary theory texts that most people wouldn't even recognize, let alone read. This was his sanctuary, the sanctuary that lately had begun to feel a little less impenetrable. It started subtly, an almost imperceptible shift in the familiar landscape of his body. A dull ache, persistent but mild, somewhere under his right armpit, radiating a faint pull into his chest. He dismissed it as muscle strain, a consequence of hunching over his laptop for 12 hours, or perhaps the awkward contortions required to reach that particularly dusty copy of Foucault on the top shelf. He was a writer, not an athlete. Physical discomfort was just part of the creative process, he reasoned. Then came the lump. He discovered it by accident, one lazy Saturday morning, reaching across his chest to scratch an itch. His fingers brushed against something firm, unnervingly solid, beneath the skin of his right breast, just shy of his nipple. It was small, maybe the size of a marble, but distinct. He prodded it, a flicker of mild curiosity, then a wave of annoyance. Probably a benign cyst. He'd read about those. Common, harmless, nothing to disrupt the exquisite intellectual tapestry he was weaving. He resolved to ignore it, to will it away with sheer disinterest, just as he willed away the incessant calls from his sister, Eleanor, to get out more. Weeks bled into a month. The dull ache, once a whisper, became a low thrum, a persistent, unwelcome bass note in the symphony of his meticulously ordered existence. The lump, though not visibly larger, felt marginally more prominent, a pebble in his shoe that he couldn't quite shake out. He found himself subconsciously touching it, a nervous habit. The occasional nipple discharge, a faint rust-colored stain on his t-shirt, he attributed to a stray coffee spill, then to a sudden, uncharacteristic clumsiness. His intellectualizing mind worked overtime, constructing elaborate, benign explanations. He was a man of reason, of logic, of empirical evidence. His body surely would conform to these principles. Eleanor, however, was a woman of pragmatism and piercing intuition. She arrived unannounced one Tuesday evening, armed with a Tupperware container of her infamous lentil soup and a grim determination that always unnerved Christopher. She was 28, a corporate lawyer, sharp-edged and efficient, a stark contrast to Christopher's languid artistic temperament. "You look sallow, Chris," she observed, her gaze raking over him as he reluctantly opened the door. "And what's with the constant fidgeting?" He tried to deflect, muttering something about a particularly challenging paragraph. She wasn't buying it. Over bowls of lukewarm lentil soup, she cornered him. "Seriously, what's going on? You've been off. More than usual." He sighed, stirring his soup. "It's nothing. Just a pulling sensation. And a small thing. Probably nothing." He gestured vaguely towards his chest, instantly regretting the admission. Eleanor's fork clattered against her bowl. Her eyes narrowed, the lawyer in her instantly activated. "A thing? Christopher, what thing?" he squirmed. "Just a lump. Here." He touched the spot, feeling a blush creep up his neck. It felt absurd, discussing something so physical, so unliterary. Eleanor thankfully didn't gasp or make a scene. Her expression became intensely focused. "A lump? In your breast? How long have you had it?" "A few weeks, maybe a month," he mumbled, trying to sound casual. "It's probably just a cyst. I'll get around to it." Her voice was calm but threaded with an undeniable steel. "No, Christopher, you're getting it checked now, or at least tomorrow morning. I'm making the appointment. What's your doctor's number?" He argued, of course. He cited his busy writing schedule, the inconvenience, the sheer unlikelihood of anything serious. But Eleanor was like an immovable object when she set her mind to something. He saw the flicker of genuine concern in her eyes, a rare crack in her professional armor, and something in him, Perhaps a primal instinct he usually suppressed yielded. The appointment was made for the following afternoon. Dr. Anya Sharma, his general practitioner, was a no-nonsense woman with kind eyes and a direct manner. Christopher sat on the examination table, feeling ridiculous as he explained the pulling sensation and the thing. Dr. Sharma listened patiently, then conducted a manual examination. Her touch was firm, professional. He felt her fingers probe, then linger. Her expression remained neutral, but the silence stretched, thick and heavy. "It's firm, Christopher," she said, her voice measured, "and immobile, and there's some tenderness. I'm going to send you for a mammogram and an ultrasound immediately, and a referral for a biopsy." The words hung in the air, cold and clinical. Mammogram, ultrasound, biopsy. The medical jargon, usually so much intellectual fodder, now felt like a foreign language spoken directly to his gut. He nodded, suddenly feeling a chill despite the warm room. The next few days were a blur of sterile waiting rooms and increasingly invasive procedures. The mammogram compressed his chest with an impersonal force. The ultrasound technician moved a cold wand over his skin, her eyes glued to the grayscale images flickering on the screen, her lips a thin, unreadable line. The biopsy was the worst, a local anesthetic, then the dull, unsettling pressure as the needle plunged into the lump, extracting tissue samples. He lay there staring at the ceiling tiles, a grotesque parody of literary introspection. Each click of the biopsy gun echoed in the silent room, a tiny percussive assault on his carefully constructed world. Then came the call. 2 days later, Dr. Sharma's voice, devoid of her usual warmth, simply stated, "Christopher, the results are back. Can you come in today and perhaps bring someone with you?" He knew. The carefully maintained facade of cynical detachment crumbled instantly. He called Eleanor, his voice sounding strangely hollow even to his own ears. She was there within 20 minutes, her face pale but resolute. The doctor's office felt colder than usual. Dr. Sharma sat across from them, her hands clasped on the desk. On the screen behind her, an image of a dark, irregular mass glowed ominously. "Christopher," she began, her gaze direct, "the pathology report confirms it. It's invasive ductal carcinoma, stage UIB, HER2 positive." She paused, letting the words sink in. "It's breast cancer." The air left Christopher's lungs in a silent whoosh. Cancer. Not some abstract concept, not a plot device in a literary novel, but a tangible, insidious invader within his own flesh. His body, the very vessel of his intellect, had betrayed him. He felt a profound sense of injustice, a raw, illogical anger. Eleanor gasped, a sharp, choked sound. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and unshed tears. Dr. Sharma continued, her voice regrettably calm amidst the storm brewing inside Christopher. "HER2 positive means it's an aggressive type. We're going to need to start intensive treatment immediately. We're looking at chemotherapy first, likely followed by surgery and possibly radiation, and targeted therapy to block the HER2 protein." She pulled out a diagram, pointing to various nodes and pathways, her words a meaningless drone against the roaring in Christopher's ears. "The prognosis? It's serious, Christopher. We need to act fast." He heard fragments. Aggressive, immediate, serious. The comfortable intellectual bubble he lived in was not merely popped, it was violently shattered. All his carefully cultivated cynicism, his detached observation of the world, offered no defense against this cold, hard reality. He was just a man, vulnerable and terrified. Later that evening, after Eleanor had driven him home in a stunned silence and called their grandmother Agnes, the doorbell rang. It was Agnes, 82, her silver hair pulled back in a loose braid, wearing an incongruous, tie-dyed tunic. Eleanor, still tear-streaked, opened the door. "Christopher, my dear," Agnes said, her voice soft, her eyes usually twinkling with mischief, now deep and knowing. She walked directly to him, where he sat slumped on his armchair, the rejection email still mocking him from his laptop screen. She didn't offer platitudes. She didn't break down. She simply took his hand, her slender, surprisingly strong fingers wrapping around his. Her touch was warm, grounding. He looked into her eyes, expecting pity or despair. Instead, he saw an unsettling calm, a profound stillness that unnerved him more than any outburst. It was the calm of someone who had faced the world's harsh realities countless times and remained unbowed. And in that moment, he felt utterly, terrifyingly alone, adrift in a sea of medical jargon and unspoken fears. The dull ache in Christopher's right breast had become a constant companion, a low thrum beneath the surface of his meticulously constructed intellectual life. He dismissed it for weeks, attributing the insistent pulling sensation to a poorly adjusted desk chair, or perhaps the contortions of his body as he hunched over his laptop, battling particularly recalcitrant paragraphs. The small, hard lump he'd first noticed while showering, a pea-sized knot just beneath the nipple, had grown subtly, now feeling more like a frozen marble. He'd poked at it absently, convincing himself it was a benign cyst, a common enough anomaly. He was, after all, a man of science, or at least a man who revered scientific thought, and science dictated that men didn't get breast cancer. It was an absurdity. The scent of roasted chicken and Eleanor's exasperated sigh were the first things that greeted him as he entered his grandmother, Agnes's cozy, art-filled apartment in the West Village. Dinner at Agnes's was a sacred, if occasionally trying, ritual. Eleanor, sharp-suited and sharper-tongued, was already setting the table, her movements efficient and precise. Agnes, a wisp of a woman with eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets, hummed tunelessly as she pulled a ceramic dish from the oven. "Christopher, darling, you look like you've been wrestling a particularly stubborn muse," Agnes observed, her voice a soft caress. Eleanor, however, was less diplomatic. "You look like death, honestly, and you're hunched over, still playing contortionist with your spine?" Christopher offered a weak smile. "Just the usual existential wrestling, Elle. And no, my posture is impeccable." He tried to straighten, a subtle wince escaping him as the familiar tug in his breast tightened. Eleanor, ever observant, narrowed her eyes. "What was that? You just flinched." "Nothing, just a crick." He waved a dismissive hand, reaching for a bottle of red wine. But Eleanor wasn't deterred. "You've been off for weeks. You're paler than usual, and you're always rubbing your chest. What's going on?" He hesitated then, driven by a rare moment of vulnerability, or perhaps just weariness. He sighed. "It's nothing, really. Just a persistent pulling sensation, and a small lump, probably benign. Just annoying." He tried to sound nonchalant, but the words felt heavy, foreign on his tongue. Eleanor dropped the stack of napkins she was holding. Her eyes, usually so cool and analytical, widened. "A lump? Christopher, why haven't you seen a doctor?" Her voice was dangerously calm, a precursor to her full-blown lawyerly mode. "It's nothing," he repeated, irritation rising. Men get breast cancer, Christopher." Eleanor cut him off, her voice firm. "It's rare, but it happens. My God, you're a writer. You should know how to research this stuff. You're seeing a doctor. Tomorrow." The unwavering conviction in her voice was enough to silence him. Agnes, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward and gently placed a cool hand on his forehead. "You feel tired, child. Listen to your sister." Her gaze met his, and for a fleeting moment, he felt a strange, unsettling clarity in her ancient eyes. The next few weeks were a blur of sterile waiting rooms and the cloying scent of antiseptic. Christopher went through the motions with a detached cynicism, convinced it was all an overreaction. The mammogram, an indignity he endured with gritted teeth, followed by the ultrasound, the cold gel spreading on his skin, the technician's impassive face. Each step felt like a slow, deliberate violation of his intellectual sanctuary. Then came the biopsy, the hollow thud of the needle, the sharp, fleeting sting, the pressure as the tissue was extracted. He lay on the examination table, staring blankly at the acoustic tiles on the ceiling, a silent protest building within him. This was all a waste of time, a statistical anomaly perhaps, or simply nothing at all. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, a gray, drizzly day that mirrored the sudden chill in his blood. He remembered the exact time, 2:17 p.m. The doctor's voice was calm, measured, utterly devoid of emotion, yet each word landed like a hammer blow. "Mr. Davies, your biopsy results have come back. I'm afraid it's positive for invasive ductal carcinoma." Christopher felt the floor tilt beneath him. The world outside his Brooklyn window, usually a symphony of urban life, went silent. "Stage YB," the doctor continued, oblivious to the seismic shift happening within Christopher. "HER2 positive. It's an aggressive type of breast cancer, Mr. Davies. We're looking at immediate intensive treatment, chemotherapy, targeted therapy, followed by surgery and possibly radiation, depending on the response." He heard the words, but they seemed to float, disembodied in the space between him and the phone. Cancer, aggressive, stage 2.YB. It was a foreign language, a clinical pronouncement that had nothing to do with him, with Christopher Davies, the brilliant, cynical writer. This was a narrative he hadn't written, a plot twist he hadn't anticipated. Eleanor was with him when he went in for the official consultation. She sat ramrod straight in the uncomfortable plastic chair, her usual composure cracking around the edges. When the oncologist, a kind-faced woman with weary eyes, reiterated the diagnosis and laid out the stark reality of the treatment plan, Eleanor's carefully constructed facade crumbled. She put a hand over her mouth, a small, choked sob escaping her. Her eyes, wide and glistening, met Christopher's. He saw the terror reflected there, and it mirrored his own, a raw, primal fear he usually buried under layers of ironic detachment. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. His body, the very vessel of his brilliant mind, had betrayed him. It was a cruel, cosmic joke. His comfortable intellectual bubble, the one he'd meticulously crafted over 30 years, had been violently, irrevocably shattered by a physical reality he could not reason away, could not outwit with a clever turn of phrase. That evening, Agnes came to his apartment. Eleanor, red-eyed and exhausted, had gone home to process the news in private. Christopher sat on his couch, a knot of ice in his stomach, staring at his bookshelves, their comforting presence now seeming almost mocking. Agnes didn't say anything. She simply sat beside him, her small hand reaching out, warm and surprisingly strong, to enclose his. She held it gently, her thumb stroking the back of his hand in a slow, rhythmic motion. Her eyes, usually so full of gentle chaos, were unsettlingly calm. There was no pity, no tears, no dramatic pronouncements, just a deep, quiet presence. It was this composure, this almost serene acceptance, that unnerved Christopher more than anything. It was as if she knew something he didn't, something beyond the cold, clinical facts of his diagnosis. The comfortable routine he'd cultivated for so long, the one that had protected him from the messy realities of life, was gone, replaced by a terrifying, unknown future, a future defined by scans, biopsies, and the chilling promise of a chemical siege that would strip him bare. The unwritten magnum opus on his laptop felt like a cruel joke. How could he write when his own body was staging a rebellion? The silence in the room was deafening, a prelude to the long, arduous battle ahead. The sterile scent of the hospital room clung to Christopher like a shroud, a stark contrast to the familiar aroma of old books and strong coffee that usually defined his world. The fluorescent lights hummed with an unforgiving brightness, illuminating the pale, gaunt reflection in the window. He was a shadow of his former self, a grotesque caricature of the vibrant, if somewhat cynical writer he once was. Chemotherapy had begun with a brutal efficiency that mocked his intellectual defenses. The medical team, a blur of white coats and dispassionate voices, had explained the regimen: docetaxel, carboplatin, Herceptin, as if reciting a recipe. They spoke of side effects with a clinical detachment that couldn't possibly convey the visceral reality of a body under chemical siege. The first few days had been a blur of profound fatigue, a bone-deep weariness that made lifting his head an insurmountable task. Then came the nausea, a relentless tide of sickness that turned even the thought of food into an immediate aversion. His mouth, once home to witty retorts and carefully chosen adjectives, was now a landscape of painful sores, making speech, let alone eating, an agony. And then, the hair. Not a gradual thinning, but a sudden, dramatic surrender. He'd woken one morning to find clumps on his pillow, and in a fit of despair, had shaved the rest himself, watching his identity fall away in silent, fuzzy drifts. The baldness felt like a brand, a public declaration of his brokenness. His laptop, once an extension of his mind, now sat neglected on his bedside table, a silent witness to his decline. The words, once so eager to spill onto the page, had dried up, replaced by a terrifying void. How could he write about the complexities of human existence when his own was reduced to a primal struggle against sickness? The idea of his magnum opus now seemed like a cruel, distant joke. Eleanor, bless her pragmatic heart, tried her best. She brought him bland, doctor-approved meals he couldn't stomach, meticulously organized his medication schedule, and offered statistics about survival rates, all delivered with an earnest, almost desperate desire to manage his illness. Her efficiency, once a source of affectionate exasperation, now felt like an unbearable intrusion. "Just let me be, Elle," he'd snapped one particularly bad day, his voice raspy with pain. "You can't optimize cancer." Her face crumpled, and a pang of guilt, quickly swallowed by his own misery, pierced him. Agnes was different. She didn't try to fix him, or even offer practical advice. She just sat by his bed, sometimes for hours, holding his hand, her gaze calm and steady. She'd bring him small, smooth stones she'd found on her walks, or a single perfect camellia from her garden, its petals impossibly soft against his feverish skin. "Listen to your body, Christopher," she'd murmur, her voice a soft, hypnotic rhythm. "It's speaking to you even now." "It's speaking gibberish, Agnes," he'd retorted once, his cynicism a reflex, a shield against the unsettling vulnerability her presence evoked. "It's speaking in nausea and pain, and the doctors are speaking in Latin. None of it makes sense." "The body has its own language, dear boy," she'd replied, her eyes twinkling. "It's not always logical, but it's always true." He'd scoffed internally. Truth for Christopher resided in peer-reviewed journals and carefully constructed arguments, not in the cryptic pronouncements of an octogenarian modern dancer. Her gentle, seemingly nonsensical advice about listening to the body felt like a mockery of his suffering, a spiritual bypassing of the very real, brutal scientific reality of his disease. He wanted solutions, not platitudes. He wanted the cancer gone, not some esoteric connection to his inner self. The physical humiliation of his hair loss was compounded by the peripheral neuropathy that began to creep into his fingers and toes, a tingling, burning sensation that made even the lightest touch unbearable. His once nimble fingers, accustomed to flying across a keyboard, now felt clumsy and unresponsive. The fatigue was a constant, oppressive weight, pinning him to the bed, robbing him of the energy to even read, let alone write. He looked at his reflection, a stranger with hollowed eyes and a sallow complexion, and felt a profound sense of self-loathing. This was not him. This depleted, suffering husk was not the brilliant, intellectually agile Christopher. He found himself lashing out more frequently, his irritability a raw wound exposed to the world. He accused Eleanor of being emotionally detached, of reducing his suffering to a series of medical protocols. He dismissed Agnes's offerings as woo-woo nonsense, a term he'd used for years to categorize anything not grounded in empirical evidence. He pushed them away one by one, retreating further into his own misery. He was trapped in his own failing body, a prisoner of his illness, and the only escape seemed to be a deeper dive into his despair. Each day felt like an endless cycle of physical discomfort and mental anguish. The world outside, the vibrant, chaotic Brooklyn he loved, felt impossibly distant, a scene unfolding behind a thick pane of distorted glass. His once comfortable apartment, filled with the promise of unwritten stories, now felt like a cage. He was a writer without words, a mind trapped in a failing vessel, and the silence, once a comfort, had become a terrifying, echoing void. He was crumbling, piece by agonizing piece, and he didn't know how to stop it. He didn't even know if he wanted to. All he felt was the relentless chemical siege, stripping him bare, leaving him with nothing but his raw, unadorned pain. The IV pole, once a symbol of his desperate fight, now felt like a tether, binding him to a reality he desperately wanted to escape. Christopher barely registered the rhythmic drip of the clear fluid, each drop a tiny hammer blow against the fragile foundations of his hope. The graphic portrayal of chemotherapy side effects he'd read about in pamphlets, dismissed as sensationalism, had become his grim reality. Profound fatigue wasn't just tiredness. It was a lead blanket pressed into every muscle, every bone. Nausea wasn't an upset stomach. It was a constant churning abyss. His once thick dark hair, a source of quiet pride, was gone, leaving his scalp a pale, vulnerable landscape. Mouth sores made even water a torment. The peripheral neuropathy, a creeping numbness and tingling in his fingers and toes, was a constant, irritating reminder of the poison coursing through his veins. Writing? The very thought was a cruel joke. His laptop sat on his bedside table, a silent, accusing monolith. The luminous screen, usually a portal to other worlds, felt like a blank wall. He had tried a few weeks ago to jot down some notes for the novel, but the words had scattered like dust. His mind, once a vibrant tapestry of ideas and intricate narratives, was now a fractured mess, incapable of holding a coherent thought for more than a few seconds. The creative well, he feared, had run dry, poisoned by the very chemicals meant to save him. Eleanor, bless her pragmatic heart, was a constant presence, hovering with well-meaning but ultimately irritating efficiency. She brought him bland food he couldn't stomach, adjusted his pillows with a solicitude that felt smothering, and spoke in hushed, overly gentle tones that grated on his nerves. "Are you comfortable, Chris?" she'd ask, her brow furrowed with concern. Or, "Have you tried the ginger tea? It's supposed to help with the nausea." He resented her attempts to manage his illness, as if he were a broken appliance she could simply fix with the right settings. He'd snap at her, his voice thin and reedy, then immediately regret it, the guilt a fresh wave of nausea. But the resentment lingered, a bitter aftertaste. He felt like his autonomy, his very self, was being eroded, replaced by the role of the patient, a helpless object of medical intervention and family pity. Agnes, on the other hand, was a different kind of irritant. She didn't hover. She'd sit by his bed, sometimes for hours, simply holding his hand, her touch surprisingly firm. She'd hum old jazz tunes or recite lines of poetry he didn't recognize. Her advice, when it came, was always cryptic, seemingly nonsensical. "Listen to your body, Christopher," she'd murmur, her eyes distant. "It's telling you a story." Or, "Feel the earth beneath your feet, even if it's just the floorboards. It grounds you." Grounding? He was floating in a sea of pain and despair, tethered only by an IV drip. What was there to ground? He'd dismiss her words with a weary sigh, wishing she'd just bring him a book or leave him in peace. His cynicism, his carefully honed intellectual dismissiveness, was a shield against her gentle, spiritual woo-woo, a term he'd once used with an amused smirk, now with a desperate, clinging conviction. His condition, far from improving, seemed to be worsening. A recent PET scan, the results delivered by a grim-faced oncologist, revealed potential progression despite the intensive treatment. The doctor, a young woman with kind but tired eyes, spoke of higher-dose chemo options and exploring clinical trials. The words hung in the air like a death knell. Progression. It meant the chemicals were losing, the cancer was winning. He'd lost significant weight, his clothes hanging off him like a scarecrow. His skin was sallow, almost translucent, stretched taut over prominent bones. He rarely left his bed now, the effort of simply sitting up an exhausting ordeal. The world beyond his window, the vibrant, chaotic beauty of Brooklyn, felt impossibly distant, a life he had once inhabited but could no longer touch. The thought of writing, once his defining purpose, his refuge, now felt impossible, a cruel joke. His magnum opus, the unwritten symphony of his life, was not just stalled, it felt obliterated. He questioned the entire medical process, the endless cycle of tests, infusions, and side effects. He felt like a broken machine rather than a person, a malfunctioning system the doctors were trying to patch up, but with no guarantee of success. One particularly dark afternoon, Eleanor came in, a forced cheerfulness in her voice. "I brought you some broth, homemade. Agnes helped." He pushed himself up against the pillows, the effort making his head swim. "Can you just stop, Eleanor?" His voice was a rasp. She froze, the bowl of broth held precariously. "Stop what, Chris?" "Stop managing me," he lashed out, the words bursting forth, fueled by a potent cocktail of pain, fear, and self-pity. "Stop pretending this is all going to be okay. Stop acting like you know what I'm going through. You're just clinically detached, aren't you? Just observing, like this is some kind of project for you to organize." Eleanor's face crumpled, her eyes, usually so sharp and composed, filled with tears. "Chris, that's not fair," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm trying to help you. I'm terrified." Her raw vulnerability, so unexpected, momentarily silenced him. But the anger, the profound despair was too strong, too deeply entrenched. He felt utterly alone, abandoned, despite their presence, despite their desperate attempts to reach him. His intellectual defenses, once so robust, had crumbled under the siege of his illness, revealing a raw, visceral vulnerability he had never known he possessed. And it terrified him. He was a creature of intellect, of reason, and now both had abandoned him. He was adrift in a sea of pain, with no compass, no stars, and no land in sight. His physical decline had not just mirrored his creative and emotional stagnation, it had swallowed them whole, leaving behind only the blank page of despair. The IV pole, once a symbol of his desperate fight, now felt like a tether, binding him to a reality he desperately wanted to escape. Christopher barely registered the rhythmic drip of the clear fluid, each drop a tiny hammer blow against the fragile foundations of his hope. The graphic portrayal of chemotherapy side effects he'd read about in pamphlets, dismissed as sensationalism, had become his grim reality. Profound fatigue wasn't just tiredness. It was a lead blanket pressed into every muscle, every bone. Nausea wasn't an upset stomach. It was a constant churning abyss. His once thick, dark hair, a source of quiet pride, was gone, leaving his scalp a pale, vulnerable landscape. Mouth sores made even water a torment. The peripheral neuropathy, a creeping numbness and tingling in his fingers and toes, was a constant, irritating reminder of the poison coursing through his veins. Writing? The very thought was a cruel joke. His laptop sat on his bedside table, a silent, accusing monolith of his former life. The screen remained stubbornly blank, mirroring the void inside him. He'd tried once or twice to open a document, to string a few words together, but the well was dry. The wellspring of his creativity, once overflowing with cynical wit and intricate narratives, had been poisoned, leaving behind only a bitter residue of despair. He resented Eleanor's attempts to manage his illness, her clipped, efficient questions about his appetite, his pain levels, his bowel movements. It felt less like care and more like a corporate audit. And Agnes, with her gentle suggestions about listening to the body and finding your inner rhythm, sounded like a broken record of New Age platitudes. He would just grunt, turn his head to the wall, and feign sleep. His world had shrunk to the four walls of his bedroom, punctuated by the sterile visits to the oncology clinic. Meals were an exercise in endurance, the once vibrant flavors of food muted to a bland, metallic taste. Sleep offered little true rest, often interrupted by night sweats that left him drenched and shivering, or by vivid, unsettling dreams that dissolved into anxiety upon waking. He felt like a specimen under a microscope, his body a battleground for forces he couldn't comprehend, let alone control. Eleanor, despite his increasing irritability, remained a constant, if exasperating, presence. She'd bring him organic smoothies he couldn't stomach, insist on airing out his room when he craved the stagnant, familiar air, and try to engage him in conversations about mundane legal cases, as if such trivialities could pierce the impenetrable fog of his illness. One afternoon, she'd found him staring blankly at the ceiling, a trail of dried vomit on his chin. "Christopher," she'd said, her voice strained, "you need to eat something. Just a few bites." He turned his head slowly, his eyes burning with a desperate, self-pitying anger. "What's the point, Eleanor?" His voice was a raspy whisper. "I'm just decaying, piece by piece. You think a kale smoothie is going to stop that? Her usual composure had cracked. Don't talk like that, she'd snapped, then softened, her voice trembling. Please, Christopher, we're fighting this. You're fighting this. Am I? He'd scoffed, a humorless laugh escaping his lips. Or am I just being poisoned, slowly, in the name of prolonging the inevitable? A PET scan, just weeks before, had delivered another blow. The results, delivered by a solemn-faced Dr. Chen, had been carefully worded, but the underlying message was clear: potential progression despite treatment. The tumor, though not raging, showed signs of continued metabolic activity. Dr. Chen had spoken of exploring higher-dose chemotherapy regimens or considering clinical trials for novel therapies. The optimistic tone of the initial diagnosis had long since vanished, replaced by a grim determination. Christopher had lost significant weight. His once sharp cheekbones now jutted out, his skin sallow and almost translucent. He rarely left his bed, the effort of movement too monumental. The thought of writing felt not just impossible, but obscene. What wisdom could a dying man impart? What stories could he tell? He felt utterly betrayed by his body, by science, by the very concept of progress. The entire medical process, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a cruel, protracted torture. He felt like a broken machine, endlessly tinkered with, rather than a person. The bitterness festered, consuming him. He lashed out at Eleanor more frequently, his words laced with a venom born of fear and frustration. "You don't get it, do you?" he'd sneered one evening, watching her meticulously organize his medications. "You're so busy being the responsible sister, the fixer, you don't even see me. You just see a problem to be solved. You're emotionally detached, Eleanor. Always have been." Her hand had frozen over the pill box. She hadn't responded, just slowly closed the lid and walked out, leaving him alone with the echoing silence of his despair. He felt utterly alone, abandoned, despite their constant presence. The once impenetrable intellectual fortress he had built around himself had crumbled, revealing a raw, vulnerable core of terror and self-pity. He was adrift in a sea of hopelessness, clinging to nothing but the certainty of his own demise. His mind, once his greatest ally, was now a tormentor, replaying every grim statistic, every dire prognosis. He was a writer without words, a cynic without a clever retort, a man stripped bare by an illness that cared nothing for his intellect or his literary aspirations. He was just sick and utterly, terrifyingly alone. The IV pole, once a symbol of his desperate fight, now felt like a tether, binding him to a reality he desperately wanted to escape. Christopher barely registered the rhythmic drip of the clear fluid, each drop a tiny hammer blow against the fragile foundations of his hope. The graphic portrayal of chemotherapy side effects he'd read about in pamphlets, dismissed as sensationalism, had become his grim reality. Profound fatigue wasn't just tiredness. It was a lead blanket pressed into every muscle, every bone. Nausea wasn't an upset stomach. It was a constant churning abyss. His once thick dark hair, a source of quiet pride, was gone, leaving his scalp a pale, vulnerable landscape. Mouth sores made even water a torment. The peripheral neuropathy, a creeping numbness and tingling in his fingers and toes, was a constant, irritating reminder of the poison coursing through his veins. Writing? The very thought was a cruel joke. His laptop sat on his bedside table, a silent, accusing monolith of his former life. He couldn't string two sentences together, let alone craft the intricate narratives he once effortlessly wove. The wellspring of words had dried up, replaced by a barren landscape of pain and apathy. Then Thorne arrived. Dr. Eris Thorne, a 70-something enigma with a wild halo of white hair that seemed to defy gravity and eyes the color of a winter sky, piercing yet oddly gentle. They spoke with a voice that was both gravelly and melodic, a voice that seemed to vibrate with a history of stories untold. "Christopher," Thorne had said, their gaze unwavering, "Eleanor tells me you're a writer, a creator." Christopher grunted, a cynical sound that felt more like a cough. "Used to be. Now I'm just a patient." Thorne smiled, a slow, knowing curve of their lips. Ah, the labels we cling to. But even a patient contains multitudes, doesn't they? A universe within, aching to be expressed. Christopher had braced himself for the usual platitudes, the positive thinking mantras, the gentle suggestions of meditation or mindfulness apps. Instead, Thorne had produced a large empty canvas. "I don't offer healing, Christopher," Thorne stated, their voice devoid of the usual therapeutic lilt. "I offer a challenge, an opportunity to make visible the invisible, to curate an exhibition of your internal landscape. Any medium you choose. The only rules, absolute honesty, no intellectualizing, no filtering, just you." Christopher had scoffed. "An exhibition? Of what? My nausea? My despair?" "Precisely," Thorne had nodded. "Or the resilience underneath. The fear, the anger, yes, but also the sparks of life, however dim. It's not about making it pretty, Christopher. It's about making it real." That first week was a battle of wills. Christopher, resistant and cynical, would sit hunched on his bed, glaring at the blank canvas or a pristine notebook. Thorne would simply sit, sometimes in silence, sometimes humming a low, wordless tune. They never pushed, never cajoled, only observed. It was maddening. One afternoon, in a fit of pure, unadulterated rage at his impotence, Christopher grabbed a thick black marker and scrawled across a page, "Emptiness, fear, betrayal." The words were jagged, aggressive. Thorne merely picked up the page, studied it for a moment, and then softly said, "Excellent. What does that emptiness feel like? What color is betrayal?" The question caught Christopher off guard. He'd always processed emotions through words, through intellectual analysis. To think of them as colors, textures, movements, it was alien. But Thorne's gentle persistence chipped away at his formidable intellectual armor. He began to write, not polished prose, but fragmented, visceral bursts of raw emotion. Words like acid, ash, shards filled the pages, describing the internal landscape of his pain, the physical agony of his body, the crushing weight of his illness. Then Thorne produced paints. Words are a good start. Now what if you couldn't use words? How would this emptiness look? Christopher initially painted angry, chaotic strokes of black and gray, swirling masses of despair. Thorne would simply watch then, almost imperceptibly, offer a different shade, a suggestion of a different brush. "What about the ache in your bones? Is it sharp or a dull throb? Can you paint that quality?" The process was excruciatingly uncomfortable. He felt foolish, childish, as if he were regressing. But in the act of pouring his internal chaos onto the canvas, something shifted. The emotions once trapped and suffocating found an outlet. He painted the dull ache as a bruised purple, the sharp pain of neuropathy as jagged red lines. He painted the ghost of his hair, a swirling, formless brown blob, and the fear of death as a gaping black void. One day, Thorne brought Agnes. Christopher tensed, anticipating his grandmother's usual well-meaning, but often baffling pronouncements. But Agnes simply sat, her eyes fixed on his canvases, a quiet understanding in her gaze. Thorne then suggested movement. "Christopher, your body holds a story too. Your cancer, your treatment, your fear. Can you show me?" Christopher was mortified. A writer, an intellectual, not a dancer. He felt a blush creep up his sallow neck. "I can't," he mumbled, turning away. "You can," Agnes said, her voice soft but firm. "You always could. Remember the way you used to flail your arms when you were a boy, trying to explain an idea too big for words?" He remembered, and then hesitant, awkward, he began to move. First, just a slump, conveying the crushing fatigue, then a slow, deliberate clench of his fist, expressing the anger. He felt ridiculous, a marionette with broken strings. But Thorne and Agnes watched with unwavering focus, their presence a silent, non-judgmental embrace. Thorne occasionally offered a subtle prompt. "Where does the fear sit in your body? Can you give it form with your hands?" Agnes, to his astonishment, would sometimes mirror a movement or offer a gentle, encouraging nod. One afternoon, Christopher found himself instinctively reaching for his right breast, the site of the tumor. He slowly, deliberately brought his hand to the area, then crumpled inward, a painful internal collapse. Then just as slowly, he began to push outwards, a desperate, futile attempt to expel the invasive presence. It was raw, unchoreographed, deeply personal. When he finished, he was shaking, tears stinging his eyes. He looked up, expecting pity, or worse, discomfort. But Thorne's eyes were glistening, and Agnes was silently weeping, her hand pressed to her own chest. "That," Agnes whispered, "that was brave, Christopher." In that moment, something broke within him. The dam of his intellectual detachment shattered, releasing a flood of shame and embarrassment. Yes, but also a profound, unexpected sense of relief. He had shown them the ugliness, the fear, the true horror of his internal landscape, and they had met it not with judgment, but with acceptance. The exhibition was taking shape. It was not a literary masterpiece, nor a beautiful artwork, nor a graceful dance. It was a raw, honest self-portrait of a man grappling with his mortal coil, a visceral expression of his suffering, his rage, his fear, and the flickering, desperate hope beneath it all. He was shedding the layers of his intellectual armor, slowly, painfully, but with each discarded piece, he felt a lightness he hadn't realized he was missing. He was moving from intellectualizing his experience to embodying it, a profound and terrifying shift that was preparing him for something he couldn't yet comprehend. His body, once a source of betrayal, was becoming a canvas for his truth. The familiar hum of the hospital room had morphed into a discordant symphony, each beep and whir a jarring note in the increasingly chaotic composition of Christopher's existence. The IV pole, already a constant companion, now seemed to multiply, its gleaming chrome limbs converging around him like metallic predators. The nurses, their faces etched with a grim determination, moved with an urgency that spoke volumes beyond their hushed voices. Eleanor's face, a pale, frightened mask, swam in and out of his blurred vision, her hand gripping his with a desperate strength that both comforted and terrified him. Agnes, ever the silent sentinel, sat by his bedside, her eyes wide, luminous pools reflecting the flickering lights of the machines. He felt a deep chill, a cold that seeped into his bones, far beyond the reach of the scratchy hospital blanket. His lungs, once the silent engines of his body, now felt like deflated balloons, each breath a monumental effort. A persistent cough racked his frame, tearing at his sore throat, leaving him gasping for air. The diagnosis, whispered by a doctor whose face was a blur, finally pierced through the fog of his pain. Severe pneumonia, exacerbated by neutropenic fever. His already compromised immune system had finally buckled. He heard fragmented phrases, critical condition, ICU, intubation, each word a hammer blow, driving him deeper into a suffocating darkness. Then the world tilted. He was no longer in the sterile confines of the hospital room, but adrift in a swirling kaleidoscope of colors. Not just any colors, but his colors. The vibrant, chaotic hues of the abstract paintings he'd produced under Thorne's guidance. The angry reds of his initial fear, the bruised purples of his despair, the surprising bursts of defiant yellow that had emerged as he allowed himself to feel. They pulsed and swirled around him, not as external stimuli, but as extensions of his very being. He felt the familiar ache in his right breast. But it was different now. Not the sharp, persistent pain of the tumor, but a dull, reverberating echo, a memory, and then the movements. His awkward, hesitant choreography from Thorne's sessions began to play out in his mind's eye, a silent concerto performed by a phantom body. He saw himself, clunky and self-conscious at first, then slowly, gracefully, letting go. The way his hands had trembled as they traced the outline of his right breast, a gesture of both fear and defiant acceptance. The way he'd allowed his body to slump in exhaustion, then slowly unfold, reaching for an invisible something. These weren't intellectual recollections. They were visceral sensations, re-experienced with a vividness that transcended his failing senses. A profound sense of peace, utterly foreign to his cynical nature, began to settle over him. It wasn't the peace of resignation, nor the placid calm of surrender. It was something deeper, a quiet understanding that permeated every cell. He wasn't thinking about the cancer, or the pain, or the machines keeping him alive. He was simply being. In this liminal space, between life and whatever came after, the intellectual barriers he'd spent a lifetime constructing crumbled away completely. There was no need for words, no need for analysis, no need for clever pronouncements. Just the raw, unadulterated experience of his own vulnerability, his own interconnectedness with everything he had created, everything he had felt. He saw Agnes, not as a frail old woman, but as a vibrant, fluid being, her movements echoing his own, a silent, knowing presence. He saw Eleanor not as the pragmatic lawyer, but as a beacon of fierce, unwavering love, her concern a tangible warmth that reached him even in this detached state. And Thorn, the enigmatic guide, was a shimmering presence at the periphery, a silent conductor to this internal symphony. There was no religious epiphany, no blinding light. It was merely a profound, non-intellectual understanding that his existence in its messy, painful, beautiful totality was enough. He was not a broken machine to be fixed, but a complex, evolving masterpiece, even in his brokenness. The judgment, the self-criticism, the intellectual arrogance that had once defined him simply evaporated, leaving behind a vast, quiet expanse. He felt himself floating, not away, but deeper into this embrace of self. The beeps and whirs of the machines faded into a distant hum, then silence. A sense of gentle release enveloped him, like sinking into the warmest, softest bed imaginable. He wasn't afraid. There was nothing to fear, only the silent concerto of his own being playing out, a final, beautiful movement. He surrendered to it completely, letting go of the desperate fight, allowing himself to simply be, suspended in the radiant, non-judgmental space of his own creation. The familiar hum of the hospital room had morphed into a discordant symphony, each beep and whir a jarring note in the increasingly chaotic composition of Christopher's existence. The IV pole, already a constant companion, now seemed to multiply, its gleaming chrome limbs converging around him like metallic predators. The nurses, their faces etched with a grim determination, moved with an urgency that spoke volumes beyond their hushed voices. Eleanor's face, a pale, frightened mask, swam in and out of his blurred vision, her hand gripping his with a desperate strength that both comforted and terrified him. Agnes, ever the silent sentinel, sat by his bedside, her eyes wide, luminous pools reflecting the flickering lights of the machines. He felt a deep chill, a cold that seeped into his bones, far beyond the reach of the scratchy hospital blanket. His lungs, once the silent engines of his body, now felt like deflated balloons, each breath a monumental effort. A persistent cough racked his frame, each spasm a fresh wave of agony. He heard muffled voices, snatches of urgent medical jargon, neutropenic fever, septic shock, respiratory distress. His brain, usually a fortress of logical thought, was a fog, impressions blurring into one another. He was a passenger in his own body, drifting on a turbulent sea, the sounds and sensations of the ICU a distant, muffled roar. He remembered the pressure on his chest, the cold, alien sensation of the intubation tube sliding down his throat, cutting off his last desperate gasp for air. Then, darkness. A profound, enveloping darkness, not terrifying, but strangely peaceful. Yet within that darkness, colors flared, not the flat, primary colors of a child's drawing, but rich, vibrant hues, swirling and merging like liquid light. He saw the angry reds and purples he'd used to paint his tumor, the chaotic greens and yellows of his fear, the muted blues and grays of his despair. But then, new colors emerged, the warm, comforting oranges of Agnes's embrace, the resilient emeralds of Eleanor's unwavering resolve, the clear, crystalline whites of Thorn's quiet presence. He felt movement, too, not his own struggling breaths, but the familiar, awkward gestures he'd choreographed with Thorn and Agnes, the clumsy dance of his own vulnerability. He was twisting, reaching, contracting, expanding, a silent ballet of his soul. He wasn't just seeing, The exhibition, he was living. It, his body and mind, no longer separate entities but a unified, flowing expression. He felt the raw, primal scream of his unarticulated anger, the quiet sob of his deepest sorrow, the faint, tentative flutter of a nascent hope, and then a sensation he hadn't known he was missing. Air, a deep, cool, life-giving breath filling his lungs, not forced, not painful, but simply there. The darkness began to recede, replaced by a soft, diffused light. The muffled roar resolved into distinct sounds. The steady beep of a monitor, the gentle rustle of a curtain, the distant murmur of voices. He opened his eyes, the light a gentle caress on his lids. Eleanor was there, her head buried in Agnes's shoulder, both of them slumped in the visitor chairs, fast asleep. The sight brought a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion. Not sadness, not despair, but a powerful surge of gratitude so potent it burned behind his eyes. He tried to speak, but his throat was raw, a dry rasp escaping his lips. The sound was enough. Eleanor's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock, then flooded with tears. "Chris," she whispered, her voice rough with disuse. "Christopher, you're awake." Agnes stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and then a slow, beatific smile spread across her face. She reached out, her hand finding his, her touch warm and solid. The days that followed were a blur of gradual awakening. The intubation tube was removed, a scratchy, unpleasant memory. The parade of doctors and nurses returned, their expressions a mixture of professional curiosity and genuine bewilderment. They spoke in hushed tones, using words like remarkable, unprecedented, uncharacteristic response. A follow-up PET scan was ordered, then another. The results came back, baffling everyone. "Mr. Hayes, Dr. Ramirez," his oncologist said, her voice laced with a confusion she couldn't quite mask. "The scan shows a significant reduction in tumor burden. The primary mass in your breast has shrunk by over 60%, and the lymph node involvement is almost entirely resolved. It's a partial remission. Astonishing, frankly, given the rapid progression we saw just weeks ago." She paused, adjusting her glasses. "We've seen spontaneous regressions, but with HER2 positive, stage QIB, it's extremely rare, especially after such a severe systemic infection. We'll need to continue monitoring you closely, of course, and discuss maintenance therapy, but this is truly a medical anomaly." Christopher just nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. Anomaly. He knew better. He remembered the colors, the movements, the profound sense of interconnectedness he'd felt drifting at the edge of consciousness. It wasn't an anomaly, it was a consequence. Not a direct intervention, but a profound shift, a recalibration of his entire being. His body, once a stubborn, diseased adversary, had become a canvas, a stage for the raw, unvarnished expression of his deepest self. And in that radical acceptance, that embrace of his own vulnerability, something had shifted. The cancer, once a relentless, invading force, had somehow begun to recede, as if no longer finding fertile ground within him. He was weak, still tethered to IVs for hydration and antibiotics. But a new kind of strength was blooming within him. A quiet, profound gratitude settled in his chest, a warmth that chased away the lingering chill of the ICU. He had been given a second chance, not just at life, but at living. The intellectual armor he had worn for so long felt suddenly cumbersome, unnecessary. He looked at Eleanor, still red-eyed but beaming, and at Agnes, her eyes twinkling with a knowing wisdom. He had almost lost them, almost lost himself, and now he was found. He couldn't wait to see Thorne. He had so much more to express, so much more of his internal landscape to unfold. The exhibition was far from over. It was just beginning, and this time, he wouldn't hold back. He would paint, he would write, he would move, not to appease an audience or to prove his intellect, but because his very being demanded it. The silent concerto he had played on the brink of death was just the overture. The true cadenza was yet to unfold. Months later, the crisp December air, once a harbinger of dread, now tasted of possibility and pine. Christopher, no longer a phantom of his former self, stood backstage at the Brooklyn Arts Exchange. The murmur of an eager audience, a soft percussion against the velvet curtains. The smell of old wood and fresh paint filled his lungs, a far cry from the antiseptic tang of the hospital. His hair, grown back in thick, dark waves, brushed against the collar of his simple black shirt. He ran a hand over his chest, the scar a faint, silvery line, a quiet testament to the battle won and the profound shift within. He was in full remission, the doctors still scratching their heads over what they termed an atypical, complete pathological response to the targeted therapy, had finally given him the all clear. They spoke of percentages and molecular pathways, but for Christopher, the miracle was not in the science, but in the unraveling of himself. "Are you ready, my dear?" Agnes's voice, a melodic whisper, pulled him from his reverie. She stood beside him, her 82 years worn with the grace of a seasoned performer. Her eyes, still piercingly blue, held a knowing warmth. She wore a flowing, midnight blue tunic that shimmered subtly under the stage lights, a costume she designed herself. He smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached his eyes. "As I'll ever be." Tonight was the culmination of his internal exhibition, transformed into a multimedia performance piece titled The Unwritten Symphony, a Patient's Cadenza. It wasn't just his story anymore. It was a collaborative work, a testament to the interconnectedness that had saved him. Agnes, in her infinite wisdom, had insisted on performing parts of it with him, her modern dance movements articulating the unspoken pain and eventual liberation. The stage was set sparsely, a single empty writing desk with a dim lamp, a large projection screen, and a few abstract sculptures he had created during his sessions with Thorne. Twisted metal representing his fear, smooth stone for acceptance. The lights dimmed. Christopher took a deep breath, the well-worn fear of public speaking replaced by a quiet eagerness to share. He walked onto the stage, the spotlight finding him. He didn't begin with words. Instead, a projection of his earliest fragmented scrawls, the raw, visceral prose of his pain, appeared on the screen behind him. As the words scrolled, Agnes, bathed in a separate light, began to move, her body a fluid interpretation of the anguish, the nausea, the profound exhaustion. It was raw, honest, and utterly captivating. When it was his turn, Christopher picked up a microphone, his voice steady, resonant. He spoke of the lump, the diagnosis, the cold clinical reality that had shattered his intellectual fortress. He didn't intellectualize or analyze, he simply felt and allowed the audience to feel with him. He projected images of his abstract paintings, angry reds, swirling blacks, and described the terror of his body betraying him. Then came Eris Thorne, projected onto the screen, their voice a calming balm, explaining their approach not as therapy, but as a journey of somatic exploration. Thorne's words underscored the true twist. The miracle wasn't a divine intervention, but a profound shift in Christopher's perception of his own body and his relationship with the world, catalyzed by Thorne. The performance moved through the nadir of his despair, represented by stark, silent film clips of him lying in bed, gaunt and lifeless. Then the turning point, the awkward, hesitant movements he'd first made, trying to literally embody his illness. Agnes joined him on stage, and together they performed a duet that symbolized his struggle, his anger, his eventual surrender. It was not graceful in the traditional sense, but fiercely authentic. He even recounted the delirium in the ICU, the almost hallucinatory vividness of his internal exhibition, playing out in his mind as he hovered between life and death. The cadenza section was a soaring, hopeful improvisation. He read from his new writings, not the cynical, witty prose of old, but lyrical, empathetic narratives that pulsed with a newfound appreciation for life's fragility and beauty. Agnes danced, her movements now light, expansive, embodying the blossoming of his spirit. The final piece was a short, poignant film he'd made, depicting the simple joys of his recovery. A morning coffee with Eleanor, a walk in Central Park, the first time he truly felt the sun on his skin without the cloud of illness. As the lights came up, a stunned silence hung in the air, quickly followed by a wave of applause that swelled into a standing ovation. Christopher felt a warmth spread through him, not the feverish heat of illness, but the comforting glow of connection. He wasn't just a writer anymore. He was a living, breathing testament to vulnerability and resilience. Backstage, Eleanor, her eyes bright with tears, threw her arms around him. "That was indescribable, Chris. Truly." "It was just me," he said, and for the first time, he meant it without a trace of self-deprecation. His new work, slowly taking shape, was infused with a profound empathy he never possessed before. He was no longer chasing literary fame, but writing from a place of deep authenticity, exploring themes of human connection, embodied experience, and the quiet miracles of everyday life. He had finally started his magnum opus, but it wasn't the one he had envisioned. It was something far richer, far more meaningful. He also found a new calling. He volunteered at a local cancer support group, not as a guru with answers, but as someone who understood the fear and isolation. He encouraged others to find their own internal symphony, to embrace their vulnerability, to express their pain, and to find beauty in the broken pieces. He didn't preach about miracles, but about the profound healing that came from radical self-acceptance and the courage to be seen. His relationship with Eleanor had deepened immeasurably. They no longer had to navigate their conversations through the minefield of his intellectual cynicism or her pragmatic interventions. They simply were two siblings who had walked through fire together and emerged with a bond forged in shared vulnerability. This Christmas was different. Last Christmas, he had faced the grim reality of his diagnosis, the chilling pronouncements of doctors, the creeping despair. He had thought it might be his last. But this Christmas, the scent of pine and cinnamon filled his apartment, not the sterile smell of hospitals. Eleanor was there, laughing as Agnes attempted a surprisingly agile pirouette in the living room. He watched them, a profound sense of gratitude washing over him. The miracle, he realized, wasn't just the remission of his cancer. It was the remission of his old self, the intellectual fortress he had built around his heart. It was the radical self-acceptance that had allowed him to dismantle it, brick by painful brick. It was the understanding that true strength lay not in intellectual prowess or emotional detachment, but in the messy, beautiful act of being fully human, fully vulnerable, fully alive. As he watched the snow fall outside his window, dusting the Brooklyn streets in white, Christopher knew that this Christmas was indeed the first of many. And like a newly composed symphony, his life was just beginning its most beautiful, most authentic movement.